Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
Is cabin fever setting in? Then it's time to bundle up, grab your binoculars, and head on outside for some winter duck watching. Walking along the shores of Lake Michigan, you can spot some common Goldeneye, red-breasted Merganser, and Greater Scaup. Michelle Allison is a birder and an environmental educator at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. As water north of Wisconsin freezes and cuts off their food supply, Allison says ducks only fly south just enough to find open water, like Lake Michigan. To learn more, Lake Effects expert Nunez speaks with Allison for this month's Chirp Chat.
As we know, birding doesn't ever stop. It just changes with the seasons. And this season being a really cold winter so far in Wisconsin, I was wondering if you can talk about what makes this particular time of year so great for bird watching in our area.
In the winter, we have all kinds of ducks that visit our area on Lake Michigan that might not be here the rest of the year. We have a lot of duck species in North America who breed in Canada. So they're going to nest and raise young further north of Wisconsin. And then during the winter, when they're not breeding, they're going to fly south to open water like our Lake Michigan area. And so we see all kinds of duck species here in the winter that we wouldn't see in other times of the year.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I feel like people are familiar with this idea of birds flying south for the winter where it might be warmer for them. So what are the reasons why ducks and waterfowl would fly here when it is cold?
When you think about birds breeding in Canada, if they are flying south, this is south for them. So it might not be the warmest place in the winter for humans, but for ducks, the cold temperatures aren't really going to bother them too much. They're really looking for open water where they can find food. And Lake Michigan doesn't freeze over typically, and so they're going to be able to find plenty of food on Lake Michigan and not have to compete further south like Florida, where we might think of going for the winter. So they're going to have more opportunities to find food here without the added competition of all the birds that are actually going to those southern locations.
You know, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of follow where the food's at, right?
Exactly.
And how long do they stay here for?
In our area in southeastern Wisconsin, we're going to find ducks arriving mostly around October into November, and they're going to stay a good portion of the winter, even up until April, sometimes even May. It'll depend a little bit on the year and the weather conditions, but typically October through April is when we're going to see those winter ducks.
And you were mentioning they're here for the resources. What do ducks typically eat, and what do they do to stay warm?
So we have two groups that we categorize ducks into. We have dabbling ducks or dabblers, and we have diving ducks. And the dabblers, like mallards, might have more vegetation that they're eating. They'll still eat those invertebrates when they can catch them, but they tend to be eating things like duckweed, those little tiny green plants that you see on the water in the summer. They can just tip their bodies over to get to that food. Diving ducks do just what it sounds like. They're actually diving underneath the surface of the water to catch their food. So they're really more hunting. They may be catching fish or invertebrates that are below the water's surface, things like clams and mollusks. They're really finding those high protein, high fat food sources that'll give them some extra calories and fuel to stay warm throughout the winter.
And another behavior that I've noticed ducks do when I'm out looking at them is that they're usually in like big groups or flocks. Is there a reason for that?
Right, so those flocks are actually called rafts. When you're looking out on the lake, the ducks are grouping together in huge rafts, sometimes hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or more ducks at a time. And they are really looking for safety in numbers. So they can avoid predators by being in large groups, which will confuse the predator who might be trying to pick off a duck here or there. When they see a huge group, it's going to be harder for the predator to catch any individual duck. And then they can also have ducks around the edges that are watching out for the predators. And maybe the ducks on the inside of the group are resting or looking for food, and they might not be having to spend as much time worried about predators. And then they'll take turns and switch from the inside to the outside of the group. When the ducks are hanging out in rafts, they're also huddling to keep warm. So when you have a big group of ducks in the winter and it's really cold and you see a whole bunch of ducks grouped together tightly, they're probably hunkering down and using that extra body heat to keep warm among the whole group.
Wow, like a cuddle puddle. Literally.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
And so, spring is also the time of year when a lot of birds mate and lay eggs. But is it true that some ducks and waterfowl start their breeding process as early as December when they're visiting around here?
Right. So ducks can actually be doing mating and courtship displays throughout a good portion of the year, and they will start showing displays in the winter, even as early as December. You might see some interesting behavior when you see male ducks out on the water, tipping their head back with their bills straight up in the air. They might put their head forward and scoot forward in the water in kind of a unusual way. You might see them sort of raise their bodies out of the water and flap their wings. When you see those things happening, there's probably some females in the area that they're trying to get their attention.
And do ducks mate for life, or is it just for the season?
So ducks typically mate for the season. When we think of mating for life, that's usually more of geese and swans will tend to do that. Ducks are what we call seasonally monogamous, so they will find a mate and they'll stay with that same mate for the season, but they are not necessarily going to be with that same mate for their whole life.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. Thank you for that. I'm Lake Effect's Excret Nunez, speaking with birder and environmental educator Michelle Allison at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. We're talking about duck watching in the winter. So now that we've established why ducks come here around this time of year, can you tell me about some of the common species people can see and how to identify them?
So some species that we might see around our shores on Lake Michigan would be common Goldeneye, red-breasted Merganser, and Greater Scaup. So the common Goldeneye males have a dark head and a white patch right around their cheek area. Their bodies are mostly white and they'll have a dark tail. So from a distance, they have a really distinctive pattern to their feathers, and you can really tell the males apart by their plumage pattern. With female ducks of all the species really, might have the same shape as the males, and typically they are a lot more brown and gray and hard to tell apart unless you're really close to them or if they're spending time right next to the male. So the males are easier to identify. So the Greater Scaup is the duck you might see that looks black and white from a distance. When you get up close, the head of the Greater Scaup has a greenish iridescent quality. There's also a species called the lesser scaup, which might be mixed in with the greater scaup, and they look very similar. So sometimes when you're viewing ducks in the winter, it's hard to tell the difference between the greater and lesser scaup. We do tend to see more of the greater scaup on Lake Michigan, where the lesser scaup tend to prefer more inland bodies of water, like rivers and lakes and ponds. Red-breasted mergansers are common ducks that we see on Lake Michigan. We tend to see them for longer periods of time than some of the other ducks because they might arrive a little earlier and stay a little later in the season. Red-breasted mergansers have a really great appearance where the male has a shaggy hairdo that makes a really distinctive silhouette, bright green head, and a really long, thin bill that they use to catch fish. And like many species of ducks, the females have a similar shape to the males, but a little more subdued, more shades of brown. And you can see up to hundreds or sometimes even thousands of red-breasted mergansers on Lake Michigan.
Wow, and that shaggy hairdo might make it easier to spot them too.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, you've mentioned some of the common ducks that we might see in our area. What are some spots you recommend for some great duck watching?
Well, here at Schlitz Audubon, we can have a great view of ducks off in the distance from our 60-foot observation tower. You can also walk down to the beach and view any ducks that might be closer to the shoreline. And we have a great view of the lake and ducks from our bluff trails as well as our Milner deck that has a great platform for viewing ducks that are up close and far away. I also love to go to South Shore Park and walk along the trails and beach area to see ducks in the marina and along the park.
On that note, do you have any helpful birder tips for getting a great look at ducks?
So once you actually locate a raft of ducks, you might want to stay in one place and use a spotting scope or binoculars to get a better view of ducks that might be a little further out. Definitely you want to dress in layers to stay warm. I also think it's a great idea to go looking for ducks with birders who maybe have experience of where to go, and they can even help you identify some of those species you're not as familiar with. There's a lot of great field trips and programs in the area that you can sign up for to learn more about ducks.
I love that. Well, Michelle, we've reached the end of Chirp Chat, but before we wrap up, I love for guests to shine a spotlight on a bird for the month. So I was wondering, I guess in this case, what's a duck you'd like to highlight this month?
So my favorite duck is probably the ruddy duck. They are really unique. They are just the cutest ducks. They're really a smaller duck with a blue bill, a black head, a big white patch on the cheek, and my favorite part is the tail that sticks up and actually fans out. So males are really fun to watch during breeding season when they're displaying. Ruddy ducks would be easiest to find on migration in fall and spring, but males and females are just really fun to watch because they're so unique, and I think they're pretty cute.
I totally agree. I don't think I've seen a duck with like a bluish bill before. That's really neat. Well, Michelle, thanks so much for telling me more about winter duck watching. It was really fun to learn about, and I'm excited to go out there and see some ducks.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad you brought up this topic, and I hope you have a great time looking for winter ducks.
Michelle Allison is a birder and an environmental educator at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. She spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez for a monthly series we call Chirp Chat.